My name is Lilo Armandie, and my ego is a liar. And guess what? Yours is too. I'm a combat veteran, mother, and recovering high performer. This is a show about the lies we tell ourselves, how they shape us, how they break us, and what it takes to finally let them go. Let's uncover our lies to seek the truths underneath. Because before there's clarity, there's chaos. Let's navigate it together. So don your oxygen mask and take a deep breath. Welcome to Lies My Ego Told Me. Welcome back, liars and truth seekers, to another episode of Lies My Ego Told Me. I'm Lilo, and today's guest is someone who spent her career navigating a fundamental tension. In a world obsessed with metrics, how do you prove your value when your greatest contributions can't be quantified? Ellen Di Resta is an innovation and entrepreneurship strategist with a background in engineering and design. She's a partner at Pearl Partners, and she's worked with companies like Procter Gamble, Clorox, MIT, Boston University, and AstraZeneca, just to name a few. She's the founder of the Idea Builders Guild on Substack, where she writes about innovation, value creation, and the challenge of connecting intangible ideas to real-world outcomes. But behind all that brilliance, there was a lie. Her journey took her from the world of engineering, where everything had clear answers, into leadership roles where she delivered massive results, yet watched them be undervalued because she didn't fit the mold. Her lie limited how she saw her own worth and the exact problems her clients faced. Products aren't just about features. They're about feelings and intangible value. Welcome to the show, Ellen. This is a long-awaited interview, and I've been so looking forward to this.
Oh, me too. This is going to be great. Thanks for having me.
You started your career in engineering in a world of right and wrong answers, clear metrics, and quantifiable results. And that background served you really well early in your career. But somewhere along the way, you hit this wall. So what was the lie that you were carrying for so long?
My lie was that if I do good work, it'll be recognized. People will see the value because, whatever it is, it works. I get the results. Done, right? Wrong.
So let's go back to the beginning. You started your career in this engineer-heavy, male-dominated spaces, and you thrived in this world of right and wrong answers. There's clear metrics, there's clear wins, and you were really good at it, and the data proved that you were right. So what was appealing about that level of certainty, and how did that shape your understanding of your own value?
This was a long time ago, and so it was in the early 90s, I'd say, early to mid-90s. And I'm thinking, the whole gender issue was solved. I was young and naive enough to believe that. And because it happened way back in the 70s or whatever, the 60s and 70s. And because I was an engineer and I could see that I did good work, there were clear metrics, I felt that there were no barriers. And so people would talk about the plight of women, and I'm like, I'm living it. I don't have to go talk about it. Look, here's what I've done. And I just felt like my career would continue to soar as long as I could prove my worth that way.
And you were proving yourself, and you continued to climb these ladders of success. And you went from subject matter expert as an engineer, and then they started putting you into these leadership roles in management. So when did you start noticing that those most meaningful parts of your contributions weren't as easily measured, and maybe that there was a plight that was now becoming visible?
Oh, it was there, and it was becoming visible. And it was interesting to me because you're right. Like, as an engineer, no one could argue with the fact that, an engineer, you flip the switch, the thing goes on, it works, right? And I'm trivializing, but your stuff works or not. I also knew that at the time, what was happening is I was being given more responsibility in engineering, and I was developing not just what I was told to do, but then creating the projects and figuring out what needed to be done. And so then I noticed that because I worked differently, people didn't really like that. I'll give you an example. If an engineer, a traditional engineer, wanted to do a new concept, they would make a drawing, then go to the model shop and have somebody execute that drawing. They start with these prototype things. Well, I wouldn't do that. I would maybe look for different references in different places. I would maybe go to the model shop myself. I would start tinkering with things. And when I had something I thought could work, I would then say, well, now let's draw this up. Now let's make this. And they'd say, well, how did you come up with that? Like, if I didn't do it the way they did it, then clearly I must have just made it up and conjured it out of thin air. They didn't like that. And yet my stuff almost always worked, and theirs didn't. So...
And I imagine that there was some kind of tension of like trying to fit in, succeed in that world. And then obviously you couldn't help but kind of be outside of the box and stand out. How did you navigate that earlier in your career? Because clearly you were already ruffling feathers.
I wasn't aware of this at the time. When I went to business school, I learned of this reference, but it's called tempered radicalism, an article. It was basically like, a lot of it was about different cultural backgrounds that people come from and how do they be their authentic selves but still fit into the form in different ways to the culture. And what I was experiencing was that, but it was a different thing. It was that I worked across boundaries. I always have across disciplines. So it was nothing to me to take an idea from maybe the art world and bring it into engineering. And that didn't fit. It did not compute. And yet, fitting in, I did fit in that they had goals. I would hit them. We had targets that we had to hit. I would hit them. And so it took a while for me to realize that it wasn't just me feeling tension, but I was creating tension. The beauty of me being in engineering is they couldn't deny the results. But then, they would see how I would do it. And in their minds, this shouldn't be working. So then it was hard for them to trust.
Yeah, I can imagine that. At the end of the day, you were working for corporate America. The bottom line is money, right? Are you able to create a product and sell it? And, the higher ups saw the answer was yes. It's just more the people around you, the how you were doing it was so disruptive.
And the higher ups as well, because they didn't know how to manage this, right?
What do we do with you, I guess, is the question.
I know. That was, oh my gosh, that phrase was literally said in some of my reviews.
But you were delivering, and you mentioned to me once that you had this cost-saving project where you saved more money than the entire group's target for the year. So tell me about that moment and how it was received. I can almost guess.
Yeah. Well, what was really funny is I wanted to go into the field, and this was a medical device company. So into the field meant going into a cath lab where they're doing angiographies, placing stents, that kind of thing, or going into open heart surgery and observing. And salespeople were doing that. They would come back to the office, they'd say, oh, the customer wants this or that. And half of these things they'd be asking for would either be impossible, they would defy the laws of physics, like, oh, that's a nice dream, or, they just didn't seem to make sense. And so I kept saying, I want to go in the field, which they thought, oh, isn't that cute? Like, that just didn't happen then. And so I decided the only way I'm going to survive here, I've just got to do what they want. It was an engineering group in a manufacturing area. So I was semi-part of the R&D group, but mostly I was in this advanced manufacturing group. So cost targets were our main goal. My boss's target was to be spread around to the whole group, and they had to try to deliver it. And I think, gosh, again, this was back in the mid-90s. It was like 1.2 million for the group. Everyone thought it was a lot. And I was designing packaging at the time for these medical products. And I had this idea, like I was looking at the art world, like things like flying buttresses and how, in the medieval structures they would get strength without doing extra materials or different things like that. And so I would try to mimic some of that in some of the work I was doing. And it started to pan out and be promising. And I was able to use less expensive materials, less material, and it would work. By the time I had it kind of tinkered out and worked out, if you're following, you kind of guess that's how I worked anyway. I didn't really talk about something until I knew it was probably going to work. And I went to my boss and I said, oh, I got this idea for cost savings. And he was like, yeah, what? Like, he didn't think I would, have much to say. And I said, well, I'm going to do this. Here I am with this art book. And I'm like, you see these architectural structures? And we could do something like this. And he's thinking I'm crazy. And he's like, okay, so what do you think it's going to save? And he's thinking, oh, like, I don't know, 50 cents a unit. I'm like, no, this is going to save like $8 per unit. Like, this is a lot. And he practically choked. And it came out to like over $1.5 million per year, right? So that blew the whole group's cost target out of the water. And we started to do it, and it worked. And, we saved a lot of money. And so then they were trying to reward me, but they didn't like the way I worked. And so they were like, so what do you want? Like, yeah, you'll get raises and bonus and things like that, but what do you want? They thought I would say something like lab space or, different things. And I said, I want to go into the field. Like, finally. So they were like, oh, okay, we'll let her go into the field. The salesperson was freaked out, like, oh my gosh, I got to bring this engineer with me into the field. Don't say anything, don't touch anything, they were. But I learned a lot. I saw what the customer was doing. I came back and I was like, oh, I could actually do this other thing. And that worked out, and the customer loved it. And after that, the sales guys wanted me to go into the field more, and it became a thing. And then they started putting other engineers into the field. But they wouldn't publicly reward it because the way I did it, again, was not the conventional way.
Wow. And so what was that disconnect? You've described it a little bit, but between the measurable impact that you were creating and the recognition you received and the recognition that you needed.
On the one hand, I did get it in that I did get raises, but they wouldn't promote me past a certain level. They wouldn't publicly acknowledge, like, you have the all hands meetings and they're acknowledging people's wins and, they wouldn't mention me somehow. And some of my peers would be like, why aren't they talking about you? I'm like, right. They don't work the way they want. And with many years behind me now, I can see, to their point, do they want to acknowledge somebody who works in a way that they see that what I'm doing is good, but they don't know how to control it. They don't know how to manage it. If they were to just let anybody just work the way it looked like I was working, it would be mayhem. And they didn't want to promote something they couldn't control. I also happen to be fairly optimistic. I enjoyed my work when I was in my zone, and it just looked like, oh, Ellen's there having fun. Why is she just having fun? We can't promote this. We can't have everybody coming to work thinking they're just going to have fun. We can't control this.
Mm-hmm. This leads us to the next point. I can imagine that being in a successful male-dominated field has its challenges. I am very familiar. But you had a colleague, and we will just call him Joe because he doesn't deserve much more. But Joe kept proposing theories and projections to your team that you saw were very flawed. And in fact, you kept proving that he was wrong. And instead of accepting the data, accepting the critique, he got super frustrated with you. And then it escalated, and then it resulted in this wildly inappropriate reaction. So tell me about this interaction, because my jaw hit the floor the first time you told me.
Yeah, this was interesting. Joe and I were in the lab, and he had been bugging me because I was designing packaging, and he had a new product that he was developing, and it was more for emerging markets. It was lower cost, lower features. And so he said, you can't do the type of packaging you usually do. It's too expensive. And I said, well, okay, so what can we do? Let's work with this. And he said, you're going to do it like this. And he proposed something. It was awful. He would have looked terrible if I had done this, right? And I said, no, we can't do that. It's not going to work. And he just kept at it. And I was not going to do something. I mean, this was medical devices. You know, in my mind, what I always felt was, we have products on the shelf. If it's the last one on the shelf and the customer opens it and a person's there prepped for surgery and it's broken or it doesn't work, that's on me. And I took that very, very seriously. And so I said to him, this will not work. If you want this done, you can do it yourself, but I am not going to do it. And I will say it will not work. I will make sure people know this is not going to work. And, you know, you can imagine that was probably pretty rude thing to say. But at this point, I was really frustrated. And so he said, look, you're going to do this and that's it. It's your job. You have to do it. You're supporting me. And then I was like, no way. I turned to walk out and he whacked me hard in the butt. I didn't even think. I immediately turned around. He had a little necktie on because back in the 90s, engineers had to wear a tie. It was almost like a caste system. And, you know, if you were a technician, you didn't have to wear a tie. If you can imagine, at these really conservative companies. And so surprising they ever hired me in the first place. But anyway, he had this tie, and I'm short, and he was very tall. And I just turned around and I grabbed his necktie, I pulled him down to my height, and I popped him one right in the cheek. And as I did that, I'm watching all my options like dissolve before my eyes, and I start feeling like I'm going to be shaking. And I'm not a person who would cry. I was just shaking, right? I was realizing, oh boy, this was bad. I lost my cool. And so I did that. I think he was shocked as well. And I turned to walk out. And as I was walking out, I was at the door and I just said, "You have fun explaining to your wife how you just got that shiner." And I walked out the door. I was still shaking. I didn't want anyone to see me shaking, so I ran to the bathroom and I looked, and there were finger marks on my butt. I mean, he really hit me hard. And I was so furious, and I was not going to show it. I waited till I was calm. I went back to my desk. I just started doing my work. I tried to forget about it. And it was funny. I went home that night and I'm telling my husband about this, feeling like the little kid who gets in a fight on the playground and, has to go home and tell their mother, oh, I hit the playground bully, or whatever. And my husband was like, "Oh, it's about time. That guy, he seems to drive everybody nuts," because he would hear the stories or he would, meet people I worked with. Anyway, I just tried to forget it. I went to work the next day and people were coming up to my desk saying, "So, what happened to Joe?" And I'm like, "What? Oh no, what do you mean?" And they said, "Oh, well, he's got a big mark on his face. And he said, you did it." And I'm like, "He told you that? What did he tell you?" So anyway, this is starting to come to light. And more people started coming to me throughout that first morning. And they were our peers, in engineering. And I was surprised that Joe actually told them, like, what happened. He didn't lie. I think he thought that they would think I was so terrible or this unruly bee, right? The opposite happened, though. They were like, "Yeah, look, I guess we're not going to mess with you." And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, is this working out to my favor? This cannot be a good sign of what it's really like here. Because I was kind of appalled that that's the way it went down. And eventually by the afternoon, HR is knocking on the door and I had to go talk to them. And they were like, "Look, we heard what happened. You tell me your side of the story." And I told them the stories matched roughly, And she said, "Well, I understand. And I understand that it's justifiable to be as angry as you were. And yes, he was giving you a hard time and he was wrong. But because you hit him, I can't help you now." And I'm thinking in my mind, well, what are you going to do? Actually, everybody else I'm working with now is going to be a lot easier, right? I did realize, I then had no options. If I needed HR support, I couldn't go. And that was my first thought when I hit him. And, it worked out differently. But it was bad on all around. I shouldn't have done it. He shouldn't have done it. It's not a lesson I take with me as an appropriate way to behave. Let's just put it that way.
There's so much to unpack there, though, right? Because there's clearly not a fair level of respect between him and you in the beginning, right? He wasn't valuing your input. But what he did was physical assault. He put his hands on you. That is assault. The right thing to have done is probably not have hit him. But I understand in your own defense that was your reaction, right? We have fight, flight, or freeze, and you chose to fight back. What's interesting is that it's almost like he took the role of victim in all of this after you ended up hitting him back.
Yeah.
And like you said, you wouldn't have told a soul. You only told your husband, but he ended up telling people. And what's interesting is HR's role in this, because honestly, what would they have done to him? It was the 90s, right? What would they have done if you hadn't hit him back and you complained? And what were the repercussions for you? So what did that experience teach you about when to play by the rules and when to break them, knowing that hitting him was not the right answer? Right. What did that moment teach you about when being right isn't enough?
Okay, being right wasn't enough. It taught me something about myself as well. I don't know what he thought was going to happen, he probably wasn't thinking. And, I was not one to back down, so I was provoking him. And I don't cower and cry. I was the one I would fight instead of, the flee. And I think what I took with me from that is, okay, this is going to be my first reaction. Don't do it. Think for a minute first. Now, I may still come back at somebody, but I'm certainly not going to respond in kind.
Yeah.
Even if they verbally say something terrible, I usually wait. I also learned that there are ways to get your point across that don't have anything to do with metrics and value, right? With hindsight now and maturity, the compassionate me would look at him and say, this guy, he gave a lot of people a hard time, right? He probably needed a win.
Yeah.
And I was an easy target. I'm the girl in the group, right? And he thought he could push me around. And what I also learned was if I had given into that, then he would have thought that that's the way to treat me as well.
Right.
So it's a fine line. I mean, slugging him was certainly not the way to go, but also even before, what prompted him to hit me first, right? He could have probably used a little compassion, but at that point, the youngest engineer, the only female engineer, I was getting dismissed all the time, and I was sick of it. So I always had to prove. I was just done, know? So.
I mean, and being right doesn't necessarily mean successful, right? And after this, you realized measurable results alone don't guarantee value or recognition, which leads to your pivot into innovation. And this is a world where so much of your value comes from ideas, frameworks, and foresight, those things that are actually truly intangible. But in innovation, 70 to 90% of R&D fails. And the very foundation of your own experience addresses this. So simply put, this is what I took away from your class. People jump from a hunch to a solution without clarifying the idea. And that's where failure is. And you had a great example that you brought up about Apple when they became the first company to hit a $1 trillion valuation. And only 9% was attributable to tangible assets because they're really a hardware company. So 91% of that valuation was intangible. So tell me more about that valuation and how critical intangibility is.
Yeah. So when I was in business school, I learned about intangible assets. You're learning about assets and asset allocation and, all those things. And I thought they were fascinating because of my prior experiences as an engineer. And I thought, this is beautiful. This is what I was doing. I was creating intangible value. And so then I thought, well, I've got to find who's measuring this, who's doing this. I've got to latch onto these people. And I found that there were a few accountant types who were trying to quantify this, but there was not much being done. So at this point, we're up into the early 2000s and realizing that I've got to just keep my head down, do my work. I've got to show this. And I ended up working in a consulting company where I didn't have to get the clients to believe it. We would go do the work and then present the results. And so that was, I guess you'd call it a big professional workaround, right? But then when I was on my own and I was developing content for speaking, I realized I found a reference, and it was newer. It was written in like a book by these authors who were economists and academics out of Imperial College, London. It was, Jonathan Haskell was the primary academic on that. And he wrote a book. It was called Capitalism Without Capital. And it was about the rise of intangible assets. And he characterized intangible assets. And that Apple example was in his book. And I thought, this is it. This guy gets it. Like, this is what the value is. And when he said that 91% of that $1 trillion value, the way he characterized it, he went through their publicly available materials, like, the income statements, balance sheets, profit and loss. And he said it was 9% that was only attributable to their investment in the tangible assets. And that the way they defined the intangible assets and characterized them, 91% of their investments was on these intangible assets that created value, that supported the tangible. And so he gave the examples of things like They invested a lot in knowledge management systems so that there was cross-company communication. He pointed out that if you think about the App Store, yes, the App Store is a place you go, you buy things, it's a marketplace, but the value, they invest a lot in the app developer networks that they support. And what are they doing there? They're investing heavily in helping other people to be able to make money, right? And yet that's where they make a lot of money. And then the knock-on effect is, well, if they're doing that, then people need more of their phones too, right? And they're making money across the chain. This is the value of the intangible. And companies don't want to believe that, right? They want to say, well, sure, we're a hardware company, but the savvy ones, the really successful ones, know that they can't cut the investment in the intangible things because that's what's really supporting it. The key, though, and this is what I realized my work was about, is making sure you're investing in the right intangible things. You just don't go, oh, we need to have a community because Apple has a community, so we have to have one too. And it's like, they have no intention behind it. They don't, to the work that I do, they don't develop the idea, how does it support their overall purpose? They may figure out a way that it might while they're sitting in a conference room, but they don't really connect it all the way through to their customer value in the right way. And so that's how I developed that. Haskell wrote a follow-on book where he said, geez, not a lot of people are actually grabbing this. Well, first of all, if you ever read some of this academic writing, it's like, oh boy, while I was equally riveted by the content on each page, it was hard for me to keep my eyes open, right? I'm thinking, oh, honey, do you even like your topic? Because you're killing it, right? But I get it, this is academic writing, But then I read the follow-on book, and their hypotheses were, our institutions, we're eroding the institutions that really support the intangible value that societies need and things like that. And I was like, no, it's that people don't know how to work with the intangibles. We don't teach it. We don't know how to work with it. And that my work is all about how do we work with the intangibles. And a colleague said, you should develop programming to help other people to learn to do this, because otherwise you're just doing it behind the scenes and giving the results to companies that can pay you for it. Do you need to help them make more money?
Right.
When everybody needs this, clearly, because 70 to 90% of all new ventures are failing, those people need this type of knowledge and help.
You're helping people see the things that they can't, right? Or even feel, because right now on my desk, I have 5 Apple products. I'm heavily Apple dependent. They should definitely sponsor this podcast. However, they're selling technology. That's the tangible asset. But what I buy as a consumer is seamlessness. And now I live with everything Apple because it is so easy, right? And how do you package that? And how do you measure that too? So with that being said, why do you still think that people, inventors, innovators, entrepreneurs, companies still resist accepting that intangible factors drive success?
I think they would believe it if they could measure it along the way. And that's one of the things that I've worked really hard on is it's less about coming up with, I'm using air quotes here, coming up with the right idea that a customer says they like, right? It's about really digging deep to understand their deeper motivations, but then how do you translate from that motivation to the right thing? How do you develop the criteria that enables others to preserve that intention and that translation? And so that's what I've worked really hard to do, and developing assessment metrics to do that along the way, because the end goal metrics, does the cash register ring? Are we selling? That's a little bit late, to figure out that you're doing the wrong thing. It's a lot late, and that's usually when we find out. And so what happens is people jump to those end metrics way too early. So either they're not failing because they're making something that we already know because we already know how to measure it in some way. So some new idea just gets squashed into, a framework that we already know. Or the good idea, it dies because people don't know how to do it. There are people who intuitively do it, but what we then depend on is that those people who know how to intuitively do it also can create a company, run a company, tell everybody else what to do. Because, we don't have standard ways of communicating that. And so that's what I've worked to build, is some standardized frameworks and what success criteria should look like, but in a way that it allows them all to be different. The specific metrics are going to be different for each project and each company.
And you've worked with really big clients. We talked about P&G. This is the company that revolutionizes household items. And one of their many life-changing products, which I love and have in my own house, is Swiffer. And this was a product that you told me nobody asked for, right? People tested it and said they hated it. And yet it has become a $500 million brand and holds 30% of the category in brooms and mops. What was the deeper insight that led to this product's success? And how has that adapted across hundreds of brands that you now support?
Yeah, so I worked for the company that developed the idea for P&G behind that. And the people who actually worked on that product in the company I was with, if you look up the patent, they're the only two names that are not Procter Gamble employees, which I think is fascinating. People always said they wanted the floor cleaning to be faster. And instead of just taking that as marching orders, they said, well, let's really dissect that. And the two people who did that, they were really brilliant. And they realized, well, actually people are spending more time cleaning the thing they use to clean the floor. So if we can make that process faster, let's make the process of cleaning cleaner, then it will be faster. But nobody's asking to make the process of cleaning cleaner. They were saying that was the insight that drove that. But honestly, everything that we worked on in that company, the ones that I specifically worked on with P&G were like Pampers. And we were doing the same thing. But what was interesting is we were doing that work sort of behind the scenes, because if you were doing it with the clients, they were like, well, we have to hit these measures and we have to hit these metrics. And so when people would say, we have to do this certain test, if we said it's too early to do that test, very often if they would do the consumer test too early, the one that they wanted, that would give them the downstream, and by downstream I mean right before you launch, those types of test processes that you do, the customers wouldn't get it. So they would say no, and we would say, no, we're not measuring the right thing at the right stage. So of course they're not going to like it at this stage. It's just the way it goes. And so what we would have to do is then work on what I called that success criteria, where, I think you called it the 4 pillars, which I think is great because I put them together as a framework, but I like them as pillars, which is, what does the customer have to perceive? How do they have to interact with it? How do they have to access it? And how does it need to function? And so what's interesting about that to me is technology is just one of 4 pieces, right?
Yeah.
How many times do we start with a technology and then try to stick it somewhere and make a problem out of it, right? And everybody surely needs my technology. And I always tell people, nobody wants to buy your technology. Nobody even wants to buy your products, right? How do you make it such that you are fitting into their life and satisfying their motivations in a way that they wouldn't even think to ask for? So when I looked at that body of work, whether it was Swiffer that those two people worked on, or the work that I was then doing, and all the projects we were doing, and then after I left that company, everything that I've done, and even looking back at what I had done as an engineer in the medical device company, what I realized is that I was intuitively doing this. And so what I did in order to create a program is I said, I've got to codify this in a way that other people can learn about it and do it too. Because it's not special. Some people just do it more easily, but we shouldn't be the only ones to do it, right? We need critical mass. We need more people to learn to do this.
I love that you've turned that into your work now, right? Before you were just kind of problem solving, and now you're helping people identify the why, the idea, and getting the clarification. So how does this framework help entrepreneurs avoid that 70 to 90% failure rate? And I think there's a lot of parallels that we can just apply to life itself.
It works for them because those pillars are not things that customers can tell you directly. And I cannot count the methods that are out there that start with the customer. They say, talk to customers, learn about their pain points. And typically they're things that customers can articulate. And customers can't articulate their deepest motivations. We don't think that way, right? Like, if someone's asking us, we don't even know how to answer that question. Like, tell me, Catherine, what are your deepest, darkest motivations? You don't know that we're talking about a mop, right? I don't know. How's that going to play in? Or a diaper or whatever it is. Even in diabetes, nobody really talks about that. It's like, oh, I wish I didn't have diabetes. What more do you want? People don't talk that way. So you have to derive that, which means you have to understand them. You have to learn about them. And the way I tell people in my programs and when I'm teaching new people on teams is I say, we have to understand them like they're a dear, dear friend. And we want to buy them a gift. And we know that they really need something that they would never buy for themselves. And what would that be? Because you've probably been given a gift that you would never buy for yourself. And when that person gives it to you, you think, oh my gosh, they saw into my soul. And you probably couldn't even articulate why that meant so much to you.
Right.
That's how I want every customer to feel.
I mean, there's so much psychology that goes into it. And I think what's brilliant about you is that you have the emotional intelligence to understand that, right? Which doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with engineers all the time.
No. But I find that they have more than they think they have. They're just told not to let it out, right? They're like that it's a bad thing that if it comes out, right? In fact, even look at my experience as an engineer, right? Like, we can't publicly reward this. Oh my goodness. Because it's all about data, and that's what matters. I had a person in a program once who said, we're told that data, there's no emotion in data. The data is just data. And that's what they're taught.
Wow. And why is that false?
It is and it isn't. The data has no emotion. But how the data comes to be is all about emotion. And people forget that part.
And data can be interpreted how you want it, though, right? There's inherent bias even when you have raw data.
Oh, absolutely. I worked with a woman who always jumped to this example because she had worked at a big company that was highly metric driven. And when she would try to do anything that was new or different, she would finally get exasperated and say, I can produce a study with 1 million respondents that will give you data that would prove, and I'm using air quotes, that I am a man. And she was a female, right? And she identified as female, the whole thing. But she's like, if we cherry pick what we're looking for, and we only look for the things that we consider safe or acceptable, we're going to get the answers that we want. So I often say, the only bad questions when I talk to customers are the ones that you could come up with ahead of time. And I say that about metrics too. When we're doing this work, we have to create the right metrics. And then we quantify them. And so the only bad metrics at this stage are the ones that we can come up with ahead of time. The other metrics are important too. I mean, don't get me wrong. When you are trying to scale, of course you need those other metrics. But they don't help you to do something new. But they're the things we have that people count on, so they try to use them too early in the process.
And you told me once, the quote was, what gets rewarded gets repeated. If organizations only reward what can be measured, what are they missing?
They're missing the things that they can't repeat and shouldn't repeat. So when an organization is measuring things, right, they're looking at what I call reliability metrics. And Roger Martin, he wrote about reliability versus validity. And reliability is, are we doing things the right way? And when you're scaling, you have a big company and you've got to pump out widgets by the billions, or you've got to deliver a service that can't fail. You need reliability metrics. You need to make sure that, especially as the company grows, that you have a way to know that everybody's going to do the right thing and do it the right way in a repeatable way. Because let's face it, think about the electric company. If the electricity worked 99% of the time, every 100 hours, you wouldn't have power for 1 hour. Would we find that acceptable? No. These guys have to be perfect, right? But you can't take those reliability metrics and apply them to when you're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do in the first place. If you want to create something new, we need validity metrics. And validity is about what's the right thing to do in the first place. And then when I talk about translation, like these validity metrics, you have to figure out what those are going to be. That's within those 4 pillars. And then you translate them into, okay, what are we going to do to make that reliable, right? And deliver on that. And that's the part that gets missed because we don't know what to measure first, right? We start where we want to end up. And when people say start with the end in mind, they usually execute that by starting at the end, right? and you know, that it doesn't work unless you're doing incremental improvement. The benchmarks are clear. You know what good looks like at that point. Great. That's important. We need that work.
And the whole repeatable process, I think, is interesting because if it worked the one time, maybe it'll work the second time and maybe we can scale it, right? And there's this well-known, although let's be really honest, it's a very flawed design strategy in product design called shrink it and pink it. And it's that idea that companies take men's products, for example, and they just make it smaller, make it pink, call it for women, and then put it on the shelf. Why is that mindset outdated and why is that harmful?
So it is super outdated. And in fact, in the obvious categories, I see it less and less. And I think the good thing is customers are demanding more and more personalization. Great. And companies are figuring out how to deliver that. But it happens in the more subtle ways, which is the attitudes. And when people try to uncover someone's motivations and values, don't realize how much they're imparting their own values onto that person. And so, again, working well in healthcare, like clearly I would want a product to do X, Y, and Z if I had this condition. And the person who has the condition may not feel that way at all. We really don't know. And we have to find out from them. Or another one that would happen is working on baby products. And I was working, again, with P&G years ago, and we were doing a product for emerging markets. And people didn't realize how much they were assuming the values about family systems and customs and why we do things for our families in some of these emerging markets where people didn't have the resources that a lot of people have here that we take for granted. And the way they viewed family structures, not that it was less important, but the way they had to execute on that was very different. They didn't have the systems in place that we have. And so what would that start to look like? We had to really rethink what did value look like for them in that context. So it's less about like the linear shrink and pink, like make it physically fit a context, but how do we really connect with values that are different from our own? And so that's different. And you always laugh when I complain about my car because, again, customers demand personalization or we want something that's designed for us. And so if you are in the job of designing something that needs to fit a broad range of people, they need to be able to customize it. And so I can tell right away my car was designed by a male who was between 5'9" and 6'1", and he loved computers. And he had no problem doing everything on a screen. I don't think like that. I'm 5'3". I don't want to look at the screen while I'm driving the car. I don't know. It seems kind of dangerous. But, again, I have become accustomed to why can't I customize this specifically for the way I want to work, the way I want to drive. But again, these folks don't learn this. It was clear to me this company valued software over hardware. They have no business designing something that a human inhabits. Like, it's clear.
We won't mention the car company.
No, we won't. But you can probably guess.
Well, how does all of that connect to the broader issue of undervaluing voices and needs that don't fit that default mold?
I don't think it's intentional. I think people really want to, and what I've experienced, people really, really want to do a good job. I don't know anyone who comes to work and says, let me do a terrible job, or let me provide something that the customer really isn't going to want. They want to prove that they're doing something the customer wants. They want to prove that the customer says yes. Why are you telling me to do something that the customer doesn't seem to understand? And I'm like, no, we have to work on other parts of it. They have good intentions, right? And so then we have to create new metrics. We have to create new ways of showing them that what they value isn't what the customer will value, or maybe not in the same way. And once we do that a little bit, then they start to see the light. And then they start to say, oh, I get it. I get it. And then they start to actually personalize things. They become transformed.
Yeah.
And so they don't do it on purpose. And once they see a new way, they adopt it.
And what I love about your work is that you're identifying and calling out those blind spots, those biases, and you give people tools. And you've built the framework that helps teams look past that surface level fix that we talked about and really understand what customers need. And not that I want to bring them up again, but Joe really taught you from that experience and that outcome how to act strategically, right? And not just impulsively. Yeah. So how does that lesson carry into all of your work today?
I'm still working on it. I'm still working on it, literally. Like, I am still working on this. The thing that I have learned is that it's okay to say, I don't know. And it's hard for an internal employee to say that. And so I recognize that one of my greatest values as a consultant is to be the one to say, I don't know, and we shouldn't know yet. And to have all the experiences that I have gone through to really show, like, trust it, this works. Especially if someone's been in the company a long time, they have that one frame of reference.
Right.
And so, you know, after doing a project where I will work with clients and they'll say, what was the best part, or what did you value the most? And more than once, I've had people say, I really loved how you're not afraid to say, I don't know. And I say, but you probably didn't love it when I said it, did you? No, I didn't. And they didn't. But again, being able to back it up. And that is the beauty of age. You know, it's not just my intuition. It's, okay, yes, here's some examples. You know, I typically always have an analogy. That's how I've learned to do it. But it's hard in the moment to just step back and say, I don't know, and we shouldn't know yet.
So how do you help them trust the intangible and then lean into all that ambiguity that you talked about, and then get comfortable with the discomfort of not being able to measure everything and not being able to understand everything?
Well, first of all, this is where we have to create the metrics, right? And build that confidence along the way. And so once I start showing different types of metrics, you know, are we consistent with what the customer said? You know, before we even make a prototype or a model, if this is what motivated customers, let's try to exemplify that somehow. And then let's see if the direction we're going will actually fit with that. So we're looking for context fit first. And once we can fit that, and we do it in a way that things aren't too real. That's the other thing. People love tangible. They love the real, and they get so real too early. And they don't realize that when you're doing that, you're making a lot of decisions to make that real thing. And so we try to not make those decisions, make things not real, and really think about what is the information that we need. So when people talk about, oh, we need to make prototypes, I'll say, let's make stimulus. Let's really think about what is the level of certainty that we need now. And usually it's not about, will they buy a specific thing? It's usually, did we hit the mark? Is this motivating you? Or do you connect with this scenario? Or do you identify with this problem stated in this way? Or is your situation more like this one? And what does the solution need to do to fit that context? Oh, and they describe. So they start to describe the criteria themselves, right? So it's step by step building. I like to say, instead of building the metrics, and the volume of, responses that say yes is more like, are we building our own confidence? Which means, are we building the validity? Are we going farther down the path of knowing that we're on the right path, that we are doing the right thing before we start scaling to see if we can build it right?
It's just so impressive how you're able to instill confidence in that gray area for your clients. So what's your truth now, Ellen? Like, what does value and measurability and success mean to you now?
First of all, there's a goal, right? How many people can I teach to do this? Because I do believe that I can do this more easily than other people. It is my gift. Everybody has their own gift, right? But I don't believe that it's not teachable. And I don't believe that we have to wait for people who do it intuitively to just be able to run the company. Like, I don't want to build a company like that. So does that get lost? Like, I can teach people how to do this and they can learn. Success is more people having confidence in ideas. Success to me is maybe VCs saying, what is the right idea before they even look at, what's your product market fit or whatever these things are that they're asking these days. I don't know. So that's a different type of metric for me. And when I ask clients after doing projects, aside from saying they like that I could say I don't know, I said, what is the value you got? And they said, you gave me confidence. You gave me confidence. And so really what's valuable is the confidence. Somebody, and I don't know these people, but somebody at Apple had the confidence to go forward. It may have been, Steve Jobs' intuition, but somehow you had the confidence to go forward. And to me, my success is helping people to build that confidence to go forward in the right way.
And for the version of you who believed that success should speak for itself, what do you tell her now?
I would remind her of that quote, someone named Aiken, I think, that says, don't worry about people stealing your ideas. If they're any good, you're going to have to ram them down people's throats. It's like showing the results is not going to do it, honey. You're going to have to come up with another way. Yeah. And maybe you shouldn't be so obvious about the fact that you're working differently. Maybe just be like, look, see, isn't this great? They'd be like, oh my goodness.
I mean, if it's truly brilliant, it's probably radical, right?
Maybe. I wouldn't say that. Sometimes the simplest things that we just overlook. I don't know. Maybe there's radicalism in that. I don't know.
So for the person who's producing real results, but watching others get promoted, recognized, and rewarded instead, what do you say to them? And what advice do you give to young women who are entering those male-dominated fields?
I still need that advice. I'm still looking for it, right? Because it still happens. It really still happens. And it's not just male, right? It's the way we look at the right way to do work, right? Mm-hmm. Right now we look at tech unicorns and how do they work? And, again, their success rates, sure, we look at the unicorns, but they're not doing things all that differently in the beginning from how other people do it too. So no one wants to admit that a lot of them just got lucky. Yeah. Right? You roll a die, a 6-sided die, 16.2% of the time you're going to get it right. So, that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah. And any parting thoughts for our listeners?
Stick with it. Don't despair. There is a way. There are new ways to work. And don't feel like you have to do it the way everybody else is doing it. Look for me. I want to teach people how to do this. I want more people to learn how to do this, and it's possible, and they can do it.
Ellen, thank you for showing us that the most valuable contributions are often the ones that can't be easily measured, and that being right isn't the same as being heard. Your work reminds us that while the world worships metrics, the real drivers of success, the ideas, the empathy, the unseen motivations live in the 91% that we can't put on a spreadsheet. So if you're an entrepreneur questioning the next steps for your idea, get more information at pearl-partners.com or sign up for one of Ellen's idea development and innovation courses. For all of the links and articles mentioned, visit the resources page on liesmyego.com or check out our show notes. And if you are loving the podcast, be sure to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. And if you're a true fan of the show, leave us a written review on Apple Podcasts. Ellen, thank you so much for sharing your story today. I had a great time with you.
It was great to be here. Thank you.